This is Westhampton Dunes, a taxpayer-supported monument to the folly of fooling around with the shoreline. Under the original Army Corps of Engineers Fire Island to Montauk Point plan, stone jetties or groins were built out into the ocean just east of here. Well, what they did, they were supposed to fortify the coast, but what they did was stop the sand, which moves in the literal drift of the ocean, from coming to this beach. The beach shrunk, beach houses fell into the sea, and a lawsuit was brought. The final end result of the lawsuit was an $80 million settlement under which we, the taxpayers, for 30 years would pay to dump sand here in what's called Westhampton Dunes. Meanwhile, you can see all the new construction here. It's been skyrocketing. But one has to wonder what's going to happen in 40 years or 60 years. Who's going to pay to keep this shoreline in place because of the grand mistake of the Army Corps of Engineers decades ago, building stone jetties out from the beach into the sea? Barrier beaches are meant to shift with nature. Indeed, that's how they provide protection to the mainland. But you put in, like what we're looking at now, a rock jetty or a groin that keeps the beach static. There's no movement. The barrier beach can't shift with nature, further threatening the mainland and grabbing the sand that moves along in the literal drift in the ocean here on the south shore of Long Island from east to west, and depriving the coast up the beach to the west of sand which would naturally replenish those beaches. We're up the coast from Westhampton Dunes now, and Westhampton Beach, in front of one of the shore hardening structures, one of the rock jetties or groins built in the 60s and 70s to build up this beach, but it turned out to be at a great cost to the beach to the west. With me is Carolyn Zenk, for years a Southampton Town board member and a crusader against hard structures like this along the shoreline. Why, Carolyn?
Well, Karl, it's so nice to be with you today, and you've done so much great community work. I appreciate it. A lot of the shore hardening structures, there's a lot of rights that the public has in the beach. The public owns up to the mean high tide line in the state of New York. It's actually an ownership right. Under the Dungan patent, they actually own an easement from the mean high tide to the crest of the dune. When you put the shore hardening structures in, the perpendicular structures like the groins here often steal sand on their east side, and what happens is they erode beaches to the west. But more than that, they also introduce incredible liabilities, because when government interferes in this kind of a way, they are stealing the sand that people have the right to the west, and when they don't get that sand, they can bring multi-million-dollar lawsuits at the taxpayer's expense.
Let's explain it pretty clearly. Sand moves along the ocean in what's called the literal drift. You throw these rocks, these stones in at one section of the beach. It catches the sand. It causes a widening of this portion of the beach, but it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're taking sand that would otherwise move in the literal drift to the west from the east, and the beach then to the west becomes narrow and erodes. Should these kind of structures ever be built?
Well, I think certainly groins are a bad idea, because as you say, you're robbing from one person to pay the other person, so it just makes no sense. You're helping one person at the other person's expense. The only time you would build a structure like this would be in a jetty situation, where you have a natural inlet and you're trying to allow boats to come in and out. Then you do have to stabilize the opening between the bay and the ocean. But even when you do that, you have to take into account that you better take the sand from one side of that jetty to the other side of the jetty, or you're going to have a really terrible liability again and problems downdrift.
Now, these so-called groins, jetties, shore hardening structures were put in the late 60s, the early 1970s at a great public cost. I mean, in dollars then, and we're talking about 40 years ago, $1 million a groin. In terms of that sort of taxpayer expenditure on a beach, how do you view it?
It's well, it's crazy. It's crazy because you have the initial expense of putting them in, then you're stealing the sand from the downdrift property owner, and you're creating a liability there. And then in addition, if you're shortening up the easement that the trustees own by stealing sand on the east side, you're basically stealing millions of dollars of public beach because you're narrowing the public easement to the west side of that particular structure. So the public is losing on all counts.
The Army Corps of Engineers, as a member of the Southampton Town Board, for many years attorney for it's now the group for the East End, it was then the group for the South Fork, an expert, and I mean, you have a certificate from the University of Oregon Law School, don't you, in coastal, what is it in?
I have a certificate in ocean and coastal law from the University of Oregon's Ocean and Coastal Law Center.
What do you think about the Army Corps of Engineers' attitude towards the shoreline through the years, putting jetties like, I mean, you go to the Jersey coast, you go to Florida, this isn't unique, it's very, very typical about how the Army Corps of Engineers interacts with the shoreline. What do you think of the Army Corps of Engineers and that attitude?
Well, I get the sense, to tell you the truth, as an ocean and coastal lawyer, that they weren't well briefed on the law. Because had they known the law, they would know that, one, when you interfere, you're creating a negligence problem. And two, they're not aware of the fact that the people downdrift have an actual right to the sand that's eroding that's coming to them. And when you stop them from getting that sand, you're interfering with their rights. So I think they haven't been aware of that. I was involved in some of the participation sections with the public, and I found they look like they're involving the public, but sometimes it's could be more meaningful. Let's put it that way. I think they've been too enamored, no pun intended, of shore hardening structures and not of more natural solutions.
In terms of the coastline, there are those who say we have to fight erosion, that unless we put these rock jetties in, unless we dump sand, there'll be the erosion of the shoreline. And I mean, sometimes they'll say, those who favor this sort of thing, that the mainland would be threatened unless we do all this stuff along the shore. What do you see about that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I just think you're not going to be able to fight a force as large as Mother Nature, and you have to face reality. And I think there's been a great denial of reality for many decades on the part of many government officials, not all. But the reality is this coastline is eroding in large measure, and the reality is you have to move back from the sea. And probably you shouldn't be building quite as large structures that are as permanent. For the structures that are here, you're probably going to have to solve the problem through insurance, unfortunately. But if you're going to have insurance on the coastline, make it a one-time buyout where if the house washes away, it's not built in the same ridiculous area. It has to be pushed back. So I just don't think you're going to win the fight.
Here we are in Hampton Bays on a beach with no groins. I mean, it's a natural beach.
This is just a beautiful beach, Carl. It's we're at Road K in Southampton Town, and as you can see, we have the beauty of the barrier island stretched out before us. The wetlands are performing their natural functions and nourishing the bays. We have a beautiful ocean beach where everyone's enjoying themselves, and it seems to me that there's so much money, putting sand on the beaches and shore hardening structures, and with the negligence suits and all that. Government would probably be best served the people to buy as much of the beach up as they possibly can. And especially after a big storm hits, if they could buy more of the beaches, I think it's a great investment. Everybody loves to be in these really, really beautiful places. They make the East End what it is.
And you can see that the dunes are big and healthy, naturally healthy.
Right, absolutely. The dunes have a system of beautiful beach grass that holds the dune together with rhizomes, special roots that hold the sand in place, and it's a natural system that takes care of itself to a large measure, and it's just gorgeous.
Funny, this whole notion of erosion, if there wouldn't be houses on the beach, it would just be called change of the shoreline, not erosion.
Right, it's treated like a big problem, and it is a problem when you build right in the teeth of the sea because you're where you shouldn't be, similar to some of the folks who put their beach blankets right in the mouth of the sea. You have to move back. You can't expect the sea to behave itself, shall we say. So the real answer is to move back and to try to minimize the building in these kind of areas wherever we can.
Bob DeLuca, president of the Group for the East End. How do you see the way the Army Corps of Engineers has approached the shoreline through the years?
Well, Carl, I think historically everybody who's had an experience with the Corps of Engineers on the shoreline has seen that the original model was to try and engineer your way away from the constraints of nature. And whether it's groins or jetties or inlet management, there's been a series of sort of colossal failures along the shoreline. And I think from our standpoint, it's also given people a false sense of security about how safe it is to live close to the ocean.
Do you think there's been a change, on the Fire Island Inlet to Montauk Point project, a half-century old. The Army Corps of Engineers is now reformulating that whole plan. Do you see any major positive change in the works?
Well, I think the rhetoric from the Army Corps of Engineers over the past 5 years, past 7 years, has been much more in line with some of what we've been saying in other conservation organizations for many years. There has been good words about the need to reduce shoreline hardening, but obviously the devil is in the details, and we need to see that report and see that we're coming to an era where there's going to be a new kind of shoreline management, that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past.
What should people, if anything, do about the coastline?
I think the best thing that folks can do, and sometimes people don't like simple solutions, but our best opportunities are strategic retreat from the coastline, which is slowly moving homes and structures back off the shoreline and replanting the areas that we have as best as we can to shore them up for storms and for areas that have already been impacted by erosion. I think there can be some value to beach nourishment, but you cannot have hard structures sticking out into the ocean. These things do not work. They cause more trouble than they're worth, and they're very expensive, and once they're in, as we found out, they're very difficult to make them go away.
Now, there are some people who talk about erosion, Long Island needing to be strengthened or bolstered to protect the mainland often, not just the barrier beach, from the ravages of the sea and storms. What's your response to that?
Well, I certainly understand people's concern, and I think there's been an awful lot of promotion of life along the shoreline as being something which is not, doesn't have any risks associated with it. It's a risky place to live, whether you have shoreline hardening or you don't have shoreline hardening. Long Island has been eroding since it was created, somewhere between 1 to 3 to 4 feet a year in some places. And we have to learn to deal with that. I don't think we can stop that process. It's much bigger than all of us, and I think trying to engineer around it, in my experience, has exacerbated erosion as much as it's protected anything.
Lorna Salzman, the history of the Army Corps of Engineers and the coastline of Long Island.
It's a history that I've been part of for 30 years, and this button was 30 years ago. I made up this button. Literally, I've been fighting them since then. We're talking about mega utilities, government agencies that are given lots of money basically to do anything they want or anything the politicians want. So this, and this particular study, the reformulation, dates back even earlier, I think, to the 60s. So it's money that's expended by the taxpayer to not only protect private property, essentially, to which the public doesn't have access, but it's money that's expended at the expense of the natural barrier island ecosystem. And it's the ignorance of the Army Corps of this barrier island system and its function and its value to the whole South Shore of Long Island that has created this problem. This is what you get when you get the Army Corps, the Bureau of Reclamation. You get projects that have no relationship to the natural resource or to the ecosystem, and that's the fundamental flaw of the Army Corps' approach.
What's the basic conflict? What don't they seem to understand?
The basic conflict is very simple, and I said this at an Army Corps hearing 30 years ago, is that you can't protect the ecosystem, the barrier island ecosystem, and protect private property at the same time. Because what you do to protect one will have an adverse impact on the other. So it is basically a very dishonest approach. And I've told this to Southampton Town, to the trustees, and to others. You have to make your decision, and you have to make a choice. And they have made the wrong choice. And their choice they have made at the behest of wealthy property owners, real estate developers, town and county governments. The choice they've made is to listen to the private property interests and sacrifice or ignore or degrade the ecosystem, which in fact is protecting private property right now. So, and everything they do is weakening the natural protective properties of the barrier island system.
And what precisely have they done that you find objectionable?
Anything you do, let's put it this way, anything structural, anything that you put up that is a hard structure, completely contradicts what the function and the structure of the natural barrier island. The structure of the natural barrier island is to be flexible and to move and essentially to retreat. And what happens when you put up hard structures, and they can be very small hard structures, very minimal, whether it's a small beach house or whether it's a dock, or and particularly if it's jetties or groins, and anything you do that is hard and inflexible undermines the natural flexibility of the system. And we know this. You can see this every winter. If you go out after a winter storm, we know that, for example, that the high tide line is much higher in the winter because of tides and currents. You go out there and you will see that even in the natural system, the high tides and the ocean level will come much closer to the dunes than they do in the summer when the beach gets widened. When sand flows along from the east to the west and gets deposited on the beach, and we have the summer beach where people can want to swim and have a good time.
In terms of sand dumping, or they call it beach replenishment, putting sand on the beach, this is also a major Army Corps of Engineers theme. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting that now, 30 or 40 years later, mostly because of pressure from the Department of the Interior and the Park Service, they've retreated a little from the construction or the proposal of hard structures. So they obviously are admitting what they knew all along. The placement of sand, it's probably pointless because, again, the amount of sand on the beach changes during the seasons, and obviously changes at times of storms and hurricanes. Is it harmful? I think there again, it's probably a huge waste of money, and I think it's done much like the spraying of, for mosquitoes. It's done to sort of appease the public, to make them think that they have greater protection by dumping the sand, and that's what it is. It's an appeasement policy, and the sand, generally speaking, is not the right kind of sand. It's not the fine sand that is needed for the beaches, and you do need fine sand because in order for the dune to replenish itself and move, you have to have the finest windblown sand that is. And I think often they will dredge the sand from areas which have much coarser particles and then will wash away. And there again, that's the point. You can put the sand on, but the natural forces in nature of storms and tides and currents are going to take it away. So it's a massive waste of taxpayer money.
The Army Corps of Engineers has been involved in recent years in updating its half-century-old Fire Island Inlet to Montauk Point plan to reformulate it to provide new ideas, it says, to protect the Long Island coastline. The Army Corps of Engineers is doing a reformulation of its half-century-old Fire Island Inlet to Montauk Point plan. Are you concerned about what the Army might come up with?
Well, actually, let me answer the question a little differently. The Army Corps is coming at this from two very valid vantage points. One is shoreline protection, and the other is storm damage mitigation. Two things that we have to very carefully assess and worry about. The Department of the Interior is going to come at this from the point of view of restoration of natural habitat and allowing natural processes to take their course. And the New York State, which is the cost share, New York State DEC, which will be the cost share for this, will be focused on solutions that will not require annual outlays of expenditures on the part of the state. Those are 3 points of view that could be described as mutually exclusive. I think that the goal here is to find consensus, and I've sort of inserted myself in the process as the individual who is going to try to bring together the different federal agencies, the different state agencies, and the different the different town and village jurisdictions together, so that we can try to reason our way through something that is going to be incredibly difficult, incredibly complex, incredibly controversial, but very, very vital to the future of the quality of life on Eastern Long Island and to the future of the vitality of our economy.
On the internet, the Army Corps of Engineers, when they talk about their philosophy for this study, mentions, it's a fancy word, beach replenishment, which basically is dumping sand on the beach. Environmentalists for decades have said that's folly. You dump sand on the beach and it washes away in the next storm. Do you think a major component of this plan will ultimately be sand dumping or beach replenishment?
I think beach replenishment will be a component of the plan. Whether or not it would be reasonable to describe it as major, I don't know yet. I think the construction of sand bypass systems for the inlets and the jetties will be a component of this, which will minimize the need for beach nourishment. I mean, we all know that the downdrift of inlets and jetties and groins, we've got erosion hotspots. So if you allow sand to pass through these structures, then maybe you diminish the need for sand replenishment or beach renourishment. Do I think beach nourishment will be a part of the solution, though? I do. But as I say, that's the kind of solution that has an annual operating piece, which I know the state's not going to want to see, because they're going to want to see solutions put in place that they'll help pay for, but they don't want to be able to, they're not going to have the flexibility to be able to keep coming back year after year to keep imposing new solutions.
And what about these rock jetties or so-called groins? You think that'll be part of the plan too?
My guess is no. My guess is that there is I think a general consensus that hard structures along the beach don't work. I mean, I think we pretty much proved that with Westhampton Dunes. I think we're learning that or proving that in Wainscott and Sagaponack. So my guess is no. But again, the plan is still being formulated, and it's still going to be the subject of an enormous round of debate and discussion from all the players.
I would think that between beach replenishment and non-structural elements, relocating away from the shoreline, should go hand in hand. It's not just rebuilding the beaches is not just the only solution that we have, because with sea level rise, we're going to get this a lot more often.
When you're talking about funding, you're really talking about taxpayers from their pockets taking dollars to pay for the protection of people with these beachfront homes. I mean, is that a good use of taxpayer funds?
Typically, you can't get taxpayer money for private property. If any private property owner wants to go into a long-term arrangement with a community, they have to give up some of their property as a right-of-way for just the renourishment and the maintenance that's required. Just doing the beach and restoring the beach has to go hand in hand with restoring dunes and preventing any kind of inundation to occur. So typically we don't get public funding for private homes.
Well, you look at Westhampton Dunes. This is a village within the town of Southampton, and for the next to the year 2027, taxpayers on the federal, the state, the county level are going to pay to the tune of $80 million for the regular dumping of sand in Westhampton Dunes.
That's true, but that's also the result of a lawsuit. It was nothing that was entered voluntarily by anyone, and I believe they've already had their replenishment that was required. And you know, you're not comparing apples to apples when you talk about replenishment and Westhampton Dunes. That was a very specific law case that was won, and yes, there was replenishment included in that. But it's not just the beach, it's also the dunes and everything else that goes along with it.
Over the long run, what do you think is the preferable course to move structures away from the floodplain, away from the the teeth of the ocean, or is it better to dump sand along the shoreline to what they call replenish it?
I think you're going to be looking at the Army Corps report. We're hoping that when we see it, we see a combination of different activities, relocation, and in some cases where you have the investment, that you may have to do some shore hardening and or reconstruction. I don't want to say shore hardening because bulkheads and revetments don't do the trick either. But I believe it's going to be a marriage of the two philosophies.
The Army Corps of Engineers asked us to submit a series of questions about its Fire Island Inlet to Montauk Point reformulation plan. We did, and here are the Army's answers.
How basically has the concept of the FIMP project changed over the past 50 years?
We are no longer focused solely on the authorized project of 1960, which included a continuous beach fill and dune along the 83 miles of shoreline between Fire Island and Montauk Point, and also include the construction of hard structures such as stone groins along the shoreline. We are now looking at other alternatives to reduce potential storm damages. These include a comprehensive plan for mainland floodproofing, which was not considered in the 1960 authorization. Mainland floodproofing involves the elevating of homes outside the floodplain. Additionally, we're considering additional sand bypassing at the inlets to increase littoral sand transport through the natural system, which along the south shore of Long Island predominantly moves from east to west.
Do you anticipate any hard structures as elements of the project, i.e. groins, seawalls, and so forth?
No, we do not expect any plan that is recommended under the Fire Island Inlet to Montauk Point reformulation study to include hard structures.
Do you anticipate sand replenishment as a major element of the project? And if so, please speak on your concerns about criticism that sand placed on beaches, especially when there are no groins to keep sand in place, will wash away during substantial storms.
Yes, sand replenishment remains a viable alternative for many areas along the Atlantic shoreline in the study area. A well-designed, comprehensive beach nourishment alternative, which includes a berm and a dune, is a cost-effective measure for providing storm damage reduction by providing a buffer against the impacts of waves as well as storm surges induced flooding during coastal storm events. In addition, sand placed on beaches act as a source of feeder material for those beaches located downdrift, which in this case would be to the west. We have also monitored similar sand replenishment projects in northern New Jersey and at Westhampton, and these projects have shown that they have performed better than expected in that the sand has lasted longer than we initially anticipated during the planning stages, which has resulted in a significant cost savings.
There has been friction through the years between the Army Corps, NPS, and DOI on this project. How are you working this out?
We have been working collaboratively with the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, both under the Department of Interior, over the last several years in developing a mutually acceptable plan under the Fire Island and Montauk Point reformulation study. There are certainly some issues between our two agencies that need to be resolved, but we are committed to resolving these issues within the next several months before proceeding with the final report under this study.
The reformulation study to be completed, and what is the anticipation of consequent action on the project?
After we have developed a mutually acceptable plan with the Department of Interior, as well as received input on a locally preferred plan from the state of New York, we expect the study to be completed within a year, after which we will initiate the required internal technical review within the Corps, as well as the external peer review outside the Corps of the plan.
Roughly how much will the project cost if fully funded?
Well, since our study is not yet complete, our estimated costs are not yet finalized, but we do expect any plan that is recommended at this study to be several hundred millions of dollars for a project up to 50 years.
Thanks very much for your time today, Mr. Ciora.
My pleasure.
Will we ever learn to live with nature rather than trying to hand wrestle with God? Will we ever try to allow our barrier beaches to shift with nature rather than attempting to tailor them to suit real estate interests? I'm Karl Grossman. This is Hamptons Television, WVVH-TV. Thanks for watching.